Well, a few years back, I was moving my daughter into an apartment in New York City. And I was not all that familiar with New York or my surroundings, and I was relying heavily on the GPS on my phone when I lost my signal. Those dreaded words, "no network connection," flashed across the top of my phone. And I was a few miles from her apartment, and it was a little bit of a sketchy neighborhood where I was at. And so I had to rely on what I thought I knew about the numbered and named streets on the west side of Manhattan. So I was more than a little anxious. I was uncertain and a little bit distressed because I didn't feel very secure about my navigation skills. When I was in the Marine Corps, I struggled with that as well. Just ask my husband. And I imagine that you too have experienced these kinds of emotions when you were lost or on uncharted waters in life, not certain where you would land. And this pandemic has certainly stirred up some of these emotions in me, and I imagine you as well. Well, in this morning's gospel, Jesus' disciples are experiencing some of these feelings as a very natural response to the words of Jesus' last will and testament. That's right, his last will and testament. You see, the portion of John's gospel that we hear this morning is a continuation of last week's passage, and it takes place after Jesus washes his disciples' feet and tells them that he will be leaving them, this goodbye speech. It's often referred to by scholars as his farewell discourse. But I envision those closest to him, their hearts were breaking as they listened to their friend, their teacher, their spiritual GPS say goodbye. You see, the disciples are faced with the reality of death, Jesus' death, and he needs for them to know that they will have all that they require to carry on without him. This couldn't have been easy for his disciples. You see, they've been traveling with Jesus these last few years, taking part in his mission of preaching, teaching, and healing, sharing meals and amazing experiences as they witnessed miracle after miracle. And the turn that they will take with his departure, I imagine, is almost incomprehensible. Their lives are going to be radically changed. And their fear and their insecurity and confusion are almost palpable. But sensing this, Jesus doesn't scold them and call them unfaithful, but rather acknowledges their feelings and then offers reassuring words of comfort and a promise: you will not be alone. It's a powerful promise made to disciples who were afraid and uncertain about the future nearly 2,000 years ago. You will not be alone. And it's a powerful promise made to disciples who are afraid and uncertain about the future today. It's a promise made more meaningful, I believe, if we take a closer look at exactly what Jesus says. You see, Jesus in this gospel uses a very specific and distinct word to describe the one that he is sending. The Spirit, or advocate in John's gospel, Parakletos, literally means one who comes alongside you. And it's been translated as comforter, helper, encourager, but perhaps its most literal translation is simply advocate. So what is an advocate? Well, in the legal system, An advocate is one who pleads your case, who intercedes for you, one who stands up for you, represents you. And it may be tempting to imagine that defined in this way, the Spirit's role is to intercede for us before God. For centuries and in various traditions, it has been understood in this way. But I'm not sure that is the intent or the purpose of the Holy Spirit among us. Theologian David Lowe says, does God really need to be persuaded to love and forgive us? Isn't that antithetical to the gospel writer's confession in chapter 3, verse 16? God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that all who believe in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. I wonder, though, what if the Spirit intercedes on God's behalf before us? That is, perhaps the Spirit is the one who comes to remind us of our identity as children of God, as beloved children, claimed in our baptism and marked as Christ's own forever. Or maybe it's that the Spirit comes alongside us and advocates for us in the face of all the challenges of the world, reminding us of Jesus' promise to be with us and for us. You will not be alone in the face of all the things that conspire to make us doubt our worth in God's eye, let alone the world. It is so easy to forget that we have been made and claimed by our Creator, and we are loved, especially given the many voices and messages competing for our attention. But the Spirit is here to help us if we have ears to hear. So both of these possibilities, the Spirit advocating that we believe in God's promises and trust that we are worthy of God's attention and love, can create in us the ability not only to claim our identity and not just survive the challenges of the day, but even flourish amidst them. Jesus reminds his disciples to trust in God. Hang your hearts on God and hang your hearts on me, because this is not the end. If you know God, and you do know God because you know me, if you live by my commandments, there is nothing uncertain about your present or your future. And the nature of God is disclosed in the self-giving, self-emptying, sacrificial love that is Jesus, who gave his all to show us what it means to be fully human. And friends, that is the good news of today's gospel. That like the disciples, what we know of God in Jesus Christ is that God has chosen to be God with us, has chosen to be God for us. And unlike some of the promises that we make to one another, God's promise to love us, to make room for us, to know and be known by us, never, ever ends, even in death. We belong to God, even when we're stressed or frightened or unsure about our future, and especially when it feels like everything has been turned upside down. And so whatever our questions, whatever our doubts, whatever the unknowns, through the Holy Spirit of God, Jesus is still making himself available to us, inviting us into a relationship that may not answer all of our questions, but ultimately transcends them. Even more, the Spirit's work of advocacy creates the possibility that we can do the same for others. just as the Spirit is really the second advocate, Jesus being the first, so also the Spirit invites us into similar work, to be a faith community of advocates, helping, comforting, encouraging, and lifting up others. And this is perhaps why Jesus moves immediately from reminding his disciples to keep his commandments to the promise of the Holy Spirit. No one can hope to love as Jesus did apart from the advocacy, help, comfort, and encouragement of the Holy Spirit. And part of the evidence of the Spirit's ongoing presence and power among us is that these kinds of things are already happening. And I imagine if I asked each one of you an example of this kind of comfort and encouragement, you could quickly bring something that you have witnessed here at St. John's in our care for one another and the community to mind. You know, friends, we do live during a frightening time with loss of income and connection to one another and even life. And I don't want to underestimate or underplay these real fears. But we also live in a time of profound sacrifice. Just look at all the doctors and nurses who risk their own health for us. We live in a time of generosity. I see that when members of our community go out and shop for the immigrants in other parts of the county. And I see encouragement and caring for one another in our worship here this morning by our musicians and our stream team and our lector. Caring for one another as a response to Jesus' love for us. And so his words today are the spiritual GPS that reminds us of who we are, to whom we belong. And like his disciples, we are not left alone. So friends, claim that. That is part of our spiritual toolkit. We are inheritors of the Spirit, commissioned to do Spirit work, to find those places where the Spirit continues to be present and active in our own lives and in the world. And the rhythm of our lives as God's people, as Jesus' present-day disciples, yes, can be challenging, uncertain, exhausting, but also at times exhilarating and creative and joy-filled. But we undertake none of it alone, because Jesus has promised us nothing less than the Paraclete, the advocate, the very Spirit of truth, who reminds us of Jesus' promises and presence. And as John Krasinski says in his weekly YouTube, that indeed is some good news.